subject matter ng aking interpellation dito sa General Provisions. At ito po ay makikita sa Section 67 ng General Provisions and Principles, no, on savings. At isang mahalagang usapin po sa taunang pagtatalakay natin ng budget ay tinitingnan natin dapat kung meron nga bang savings na nagagawa ang pamahalaan. Dahil dito, kung merong savings, ayon sa ating konstitusyon ay pwedeng gamitin ito para i-augment yung mga programs, activities and projects ng mga constitutionally allowed offices to augment their budget. No? For example, the executive, the Senate President, the Speaker of the House, the Judiciary. No? Dahil hindi naman lahat na ahensya ayon sa ating konstitusyon ay pwedeng mag-augment sila ng kanilang budget na nanggagaling sa savings. No? So, Mr. Speaker, Ginoong Sponsor, I'll start with a look back doon sa nangyaring budget presentation ng DBCC 2 weeks ago. During the DBCC briefing, Budget Secretary Wendell Abisado said na lahat ng savings every year, nalalaman na naman ng lahat dahil nasa sources of funds for every annual budget. Ito po yung sinabi niya. Well, tama naman po si Secretary Abisado. No? He is correct in saying that. But he is correct only up to a certain year. Because based on our research, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, from 2002, overall savings, it can be seen in the budget books through the so-called budgetary adjustments, but only up to the year 2015. No? First slide, please. So hanggang from 2002 hanggang 2015, makikita pa natin yung savings, no, overall savings, doon nga sa budgetary adjustments, no. So if you look at the slides, no, from 2002, there's a transfers from of 3 billion, 3.5 billion, and transfers to, no, na 3.5 billion din. So kaya zero, walang surplus, walang deficit. But beginning 2003, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, yung transfers to is 15 billion, pero yung kanyang transfers from is 15 billion, yung kanyang transfers to is only 14 billion. Kaya nagkakaroon ng surplus na 1 billion. No? So, if you look at the slides, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, from 2002 to 2015, makikita natin na merong panahon na merong surplus, meron ding panahon na deficit. No? So, note that there are surpluses, Mr. Sponsor, amounting to billions of pesos from 2003 to 2011. No? So my first question, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, tama po ba yung figures na nakikita natin sa ating slides, sa PowerPoint? These figures, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, were taken from the NEP, no, of different years, no, from 2002 to 2015.
Ang daya-daya mo naman, 2015 pa yan, tsaka 2002.
Pinakita lang po natin yung historical, no? Historical presentation of facts.
Umulit tayo ng debate, pero bigyan mo ako ng oras na i-validate ito.
Well, very well, Mr. Sponsor, but I assure you, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, na yung mga figures na yan ay nanggaling sa ating NEP or National Expenditure Program, at alam ng DBM yan from 2002 up to 2015. No? Anyway, if I may proceed, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker. Also, during that DBCC presentation and responding to the same question, DBM Secretary Abisado said that there are no more declaration of overall savings due to the decision of the Supreme Court in the case of the Disbursement Acceleration Program. Tama po ba yun, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker? Kaya hindi na natin nakita beginning 2016 up to now, 2020, no? Sa NEP na sinubmit sa atin ng Malacanang, yung usapin ng overall savings, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker.
Because this is the third time that I'm defending the general principles and LAMSA and this particular area, mukhang hindi naman talaga nagde-declare ng overall savings eh. Yung dinideclare lang po, yung savings na gagamitin. So pag hindi naman nila gagamitin, hindi nila dinideclare na savings.
But Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, thank you for that answer. But my question is, from 2002 to 2015, nare-report ng executive yung overall savings. But from 2016 to 2020 up to now, no, sa bagong NEP na sinubmit nila, at ito yung pinagdidebatehan natin ngayon, ay hindi na po natin nakikita yung entry for the overall savings. No? And the reason given by the DBCC, especially the DBM, was that hindi na raw ito dinideclare because of the decision of the Supreme Court doon sa disbursement DAP case. No? But if I recall, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, yung DAP, dahil isa po tayo, ang representasyong ito, isa po sa petitioner doon, ang dineklara ng Korte Suprema doon na unconstitutional was the program, no? Disbursement Acceleration Program, through which savings and unobligated allotments were used to fund programs, activities, and projects that were not authorized by the General Appropriations Act. So, what was declared unconstitutional ay hindi yung savings. No? Ang dineclare na unconstitutional, yung pagpondo sa programs, activities, and projects na hindi nakikita sa General Appropriations Act. No? So, again, Mr. Speaker, through DAP, the meaning of savings was modified. No? Kaya dineklarang unconstitutional ng Supreme Court yon because DAP modified the meaning of savings, and savings were declared as such without complying with the requirements doon sa ating GAA. Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker.
Actually, mula sa first statement mo kanina until now, I agree. Dahil tama po siya.
You agree? Thank you for agreeing, Mr. Sponsor.
Ang issue lang yan kung ginamit sa mali. Pero procedurally, yun po talaga ang dapat. Arising na nga pa sa DAP decision at ang ginagawa na nga po talaga ngayon kung may isang departamento na kinukulang dahil po halimbawa sa Marawi, kinukulang ng pera, kailangan mag-declare ng savings at yun ay ilalaan para po ma-augment yung isang item na deficient. Pero overall, sir, your statements are correct.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, for agreeing to that. No? So you agree, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, na dapat ang executive ay inuulat niya, no, through the NEP, inuulat niya dito sa Kongreso, no, kung ano yung savings in a particular year na nakukuha or na-derive ng ating pamahalaan, no? Because as I've said, no, nawala na doon sa NEP. So, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, in fact, noon, ang DAP was devised by DBM to address the supposed low capacity of the departments to obligate their funding, no? Supposedly to accelerate the disbursement of appropriation. Well, yung problema ng based on the budget presentation in the past days or weeks, no? The problem of low absorptive capacity of the department is still existing, as can be seen in our budget books. Kaya hinahanap natin yung overall savings, no? Dahil nga sinasabi nila ng DBM in the past years and even up to now na kailangang makita natin how the departments disburse their appropriations. No? So again, I have the figure here, with the kind indulgence of the sponsor.
Alam
Yes.
niyo po, pangatlong beses mo na tinanong sa akin to eh. Pero lagi ko naman na ipapakita sa iyo na nasa NEP naman talaga eh. Kung ano lang talaga yung dineclare na savings at kung ano lang yung savings kung saan yung ginamit, eh lagi naman po nakalagay sa NEP. So wala akong every year, like there was this one year, everybody was surprised that they thought that there was a 300 billion savings flowing over from the previous administration. But the administration, on its first year, merely declared 12 billion in savings, which was used for, I forgot, in 2017, Your Honor. But so, in short, Your Honor, there is some discretionariness. There may be savings, but it's only declared if there is an expedient need for it. So there's no need to declare it if you don't need it.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. So, that's the official reason. Are you saying, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, na by 2016 NEP up to now, ay wala nang entry ng overall savings, no? May I inquire then, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, for 2019, how much savings were derived by the national government? And if it is, if these are savings, can the good sponsor relate to us saan nakalagay ito sa ating NEP? And even in the General Appropriations Bill, if it is stated there. So let's backtrack. 2018, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker.
3 OCD.
So 2018, the overall savings is 3 billion. Is that correct, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker?
Hindi yun overall eh. Yan lang yung nakita nila na kailangan. So, yun ang dineclare nilang savings para magamit nila pang-augment.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. But in every NEP, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, kaya nga dinidefine natin paano nare-realize ang savings, no?
I think, Your Honor, the solution there is really to make us affirmative special provision. That will essentially compel the executive department that things that I did not use, even if things that were saved or were not utilized, but were not, na hindi naman ginamit, must be declared. Because right now, the way it's structured, they only declare a saving if it's needed and it's used. So I think we just have to make, I think, a very affirmative mandate, perhaps by way of a special provision, that essentially will compel the executive to have a special section in the 3 volumes of NEP. Essentially, the monies or those allocations or authorizations that were not used and were not declared as savings and were not used for something else.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker. So what is the purpose then of placing Section 67 in our NEP, which is practically the same provision in previous NEP? Meaning of savings. Savings refer to portions of balances of any released appropriation in this Act which have not been obligated as a result of any of the following circumstances. Completion, final discontinuance, or abandonment of a program, activity, or project for which the appropriation is authorized, or B, implementation of measures resulting in improved systems and efficiencies, and thus enabled an agency to meet and deliver the required or planned targets, programs, and services approved in this Act at a lesser cost. So, there's a purpose, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, kaya natin inilagay ito rito, dahil kung merong savings ang mga departamento, halimbawa, ang Department of Education, pinayagan silang mag-hire ng 1,000 teachers for the year. Pero nakapag-hire sila 500 lamang. Naturally, yung pondo para sa 500 na hindi nila na-hire will be considered savings. And are we now saying, Mr. Sponsor, dahil hindi naman ito, yung savings na ito, hindi naman gagamitin for the year, hindi na natin i-report, no? Itago na muna natin. Huwag na nating sabihin na merong savings. Is that what the good sponsor, Mr. Speaker, is saying? Because he said earlier, we will only report savings if it is needed. If it is not needed, then there is no report for savings.
Because it is a prudential decision of a policymaker or an executive. We must read Section 66, 67, and 68 as being one whole body.
Yes.
In short, you want to augment, you better have savings. So the meaning of the savings is defined in 67. But who can? So it's defined in 66. So in short, Your Honor, this entire body of sections really is not a mandate or a compulsory, but it merely gives the executive, given the exigency, as many of us know, like this huge exigency called COVID, or a typhoon like Haiyan. In short, we need this provision, this 66, 67, and 68, precisely, Your Honor, because we cannot predict the future, and therefore you need at least guidance on precisely how governments would have prudential guidelines with respect to the use of government funds in confronting this sudden emergence of requirements.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker. But with due respect, no, to the good sponsor, hindi po ba nararapat lamang na ang kapulungan ito, no, dahil tayo ang nagdidebate, nag-a-approve sa budget, at kung yung budget na yan na ating inaproba, no, we approve the budget after so much deliberation, and when this budget is implemented, no, the programs, activities, and projects are implemented, at kung merong halimbawa savings na na-derive ang executive, ay sabihan din niya ang Kongreso, Kongreso, noong 2018, ganito ang savings na aming na-accumulate natin. Yun po ang gusto nating punto dahil if the executive, since from 2002 up to 2015, find it correct, no, and prudent to report overall savings, ay hindi ko po maintindihan why after 2016 and up to now, sabihin natin it's a part of the executive prerogative, no, in the spirit of expediency, na hindi na niya iuulat yung overall savings. No?
Alam mo po, para tayong pumasok sa isang lugar na prosado kang tumambling, kasi yun ang rules. Ang suggestion ko, na isama na sa BESF, na kung sakasakali may mga ganitong sitwasyon na hindi nauubos, hindi nagagamit ng gobyerno, dapat ilista nila kesyo na gamit o hindi nagamit o kung ginamit, paano ginamit. Kasi ngayon, pag binasa mo yung 66, 67, 68, ikaw pwede kang gumamit. Check. Pangalawa, may saving ka, i-declare mo. Pangatlo, saan mo ginamit. So kung absent one of them, there is no compulsion for the executive to declare one. So I think, as I've said, I'm making an affirmative suggestion that in the BASF, all these items that are in the nature of this unused allocation, etc., should also be declared, rather than only those that were used.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the suggestion of the good sponsor, no, to at the proper time, probably at the sponsorship of the good sponsor, that in this General Appropriations Act for 2021, we will put a provision there that will compel the executive, no, to report to this Congress any savings that is derived from any project, program, or activity by the executive. No? Sa tingin ko po ay nararapat lamang yon in the spirit of accountability and transparency.
The entire DBCC, sir, has said yes to your proposal.
Thank you,
That
Mr.
in the
Sponsor.
next BSF, those items will be recorded as part of their regular reportage for our consideration of the NEP.
Thank you, Mr. Good Sponsor, Mr. Speaker. Because as I have been pointing out, and you mentioned, probably this is the third time that I raised this point, no, in plenary during budget deliberations. Our national budget is actually beyond our government's capacity to spend funds. No? This is a major point in consideration of our ever-increasing national debt, no? Which I will discuss at the appropriate time. Now, to continue, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, okay, if I may continue, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, I raised that, according to you, for the third time in this plenary since 2016, no? Because I am apprehensive that only DBM knows how much savings we really have. No? But anyway, on to my next point, released appropriations, which are unobligated through discontinuance of PAP, no? And are considered savings. DBM said DBM cannot therefore deny that meron ngang savings sa 2019, no? Nasabi ko na yan dahil nga doon sa nireport nila yan sa Bayanihan Act to Hill as one. Now, in these current provisions on savings, I observe, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, that the DBM, again, expanded, no, the meaning of savings and, in fact, introduced a new provision or a new qualification on how savings will be derived, no, in Section 67. This is a departure from provisions, for example, in 2019 and even in 2020. No? I'm referring, Mr. Chair, to this provision on Section 67, specifically paragraph 3.
Pero 231 ba yan?
And if I may read it on the record, Mr. Chair. No? Section 67, meaning of savings. So the usual meaning of savings. These are savings are referred to portions of balances of any released appropriations in the Act which have not been obligated as a result of the following: completion, final discontinuance, or abandonment of a program, activity, or project for which the appropriation is authorized, or implementation of measures resulting in improved systems and efficiencies and thus enabled an agency to meet and deliver the required or planned targets, programs, and services approved in this Act at a lesser cost. Allotments that were not obligated due to the fault of the agency concerned shall not be considered savings. No? These are common provisions in the previous definition of savings. What is new in this NEP 2021, for NEP 2021, is the insertion of this proviso. Notwithstanding the foregoing,
in case of national
final discontinuance or abandonment of a program, activity, or project, whether released or unreleased, allotment for which remain unobligated may be declared
Based
by the President as savings in case of a declaration of a state of national calamity, as may be necessary to augment deficient programs, activities, or projects in the executive department or special purpose funds that are necessary to immediately address the existing calamity. May I inquire, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, what is the reason or the rationale behind this new definition of savings by inserting this paragraph notwithstanding, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker.
Alam niyo po, tayong gumagawa ng batas, yung limitation as to the word savings or the limitation as it not being coming from discontinuance is not in the Constitution. It's an act of Congress. And to the extent that it was 67 billion of that was used by the President from discontinuance by the use of Bayanihan 1. So there was this, how would you call it? Napag-isipan po ng DBM, mukhang mainam na gamitin na natin to din sa NEP. So, pero kung talagang hindi ako magpapakamatay kung tanggalin natin to.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker. I recall, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, ang naging kasagutan ng DBM during their budget presentation is they inserted this provision as anticipatory action from the executive. They anticipated now that there will be calamities in the coming years. But will the good sponsor, Mr. Speaker, agree that if it will be so in the next years to come, the prudent manner or the act that the executive should do is to come to Congress, just like what they did this year, in March of this year. In the midst of the pandemic, they asked Congress to pass a law, and that was Bayanihan Act Tuhilas 1, where Congress debated on the proprietary and the reasons why we will give a special power to the President to realign and augment, realign funds and augment existing projects, activities, and programs. Will the good sponsor agree that it's better for the executive to come to Congress when a so-called state of calamity will come in the years to come, rather than place this provision that will in effect give the executive a blank check, a authority to just realign the funds, the entire budget approved by Congress, deliberated by Congress, debated by Congress, but immediately when it is about to be implemented, because of this provision, it can just be realigned by the executive. Can we hear a response from the sponsor, Mr. Speaker?
There we have law newly approved here, the Department of Disaster Resilience. It properly defines what a disaster is, what is an emergency, where you might use, you might resort. And I guess, Your Honor, the domain for defining where those funds can be sourced, I think must be properly located in the budget, because that is the BASF. In short, Your Honor, it is up to us if we want to continue the discontinuance. But in general, Your Honor, we have already properly defined disaster. Now we need to define where we can get the money in order to confront those disasters.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, because that is truly the power of the purse, for Congress to debate how much funds, where to get those funds, and how this will be expended. But again, if we will allow this provision in the new meaning of savings under Section 67, this is an act of self-castration, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker. Dahil next year, after we approve the budget, it's easy for the executive to say that there is a calamity, we will realign all your programs, activities, and projects in this particular district or area or region. We will no longer implement that because there's a calamity. And By so doing, the executive can declare these discontinued projects as savings. And because these are savings, the executive can use this to augment whatever the executive wishes. No? So yun po ang epekto nito. And in fact, if I may relate it, next year, talagang mangyayari yun, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, because just recently, last September 16, no, President Duterte already declared, through Proclamation number 1021, extending the period of state of calamity up to September 2021. So, meaning, since the state of calamity is now extended for next year, by January 1, after we approve this budget, if it will be approved and passed at the end of the year, by January 1, theoretically, the executive can say, oh, we will realign all this budget, no? Because there is a calamity, and by virtue of Section 67 of the General Appropriations Act of 2021, the executive is allowed, no, to realign. So, yun po ang dapat pag-isipan ng kapulungang ito, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker. In Bayanihan 1, pumunta ang executive sa Kongreso, pinagdebatihan natin, inalam natin ang kadahilanan, bakit kailangan mag-realign ng mga programa, activities and projects. Inalam natin magkano ang dapat payagan sa Bayanihan 1. At yun ang nalalaman ng batas ng Bayanihan 1. Itong nakaraan, nagpasauli ang kapulungang ito ng Bayanihan to Recover as One. At ganun din, inalam ng kapulungang ito at ng Senado magkano ang dapat na pupunduhan. At yun ang dararapat. But if this provision will not be removed, no? And it will be placed here in the General Appropriations Act of 2021. Pasensya na po at talagang dinidiin ko yan. No? Wala nang debating mangyayari dito sa Kongreso. No? Hindi na pupunta ang executive sa Kongreso next year at i-justify nila bakit itong 4.5 trillion na ito ay pwede naming i-realign. No? At hindi na namin i-release yung mga pondo para sa mga programa, activities and programs ng mga ganitong rehiyon o ganyang rehiyon.
Tama.
Tama po ba yun? O
Tama.
gusto po ba nating mangyari yun?
Kailangan may basehan kung bakit diniscontinue. Hindi mo basta-basta lang kesyo hindi mo gusto yung mukha ng congressman, ipapadiscontinue mo na. Kaya nga, tama na dapat pag-isipan kung itutuloy natin na yung biglang pagsulpot ng discontinuance na galing sa Bayanihan 1, biglang sinaksak sa NEP.
Yes.
So naniniwala po ako na dapat ito mapag-usapan at kung kailangan lagyan ng mga parametro para mas mapasiguro natin na hindi naman masyadong sobra ang binibigay nating leeway o fleksibilidad dahil nabubuhay tayo sa isang masasabi nating political economy kung saan ang budget ay nagagamit kung minsan. So, tama ang sagot ko po.
Salamat, Ginoong Sponsor, Mr. Speaker. At sana po at the proper time, no? This new provision on the meaning of savings in the 2021 NEP will be scrapped, no? During the period of amendments because this will cause more harm than good, no? As it will give the executive unbridled power to take control of the national budget. No? As I have stated earlier, it will castrate the power of the coin purse of Congress. No? Coin purse na lang nga yung power natin. No? Pag pinayagan pa natin itong provision na ito. As a last point, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, I observed, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, that in the 2016 and 2017 GAE on the meaning of savings, pwede bang ma-flash sa PowerPoint? There is this provision in 2016. No? Andyan pa rin yung meaning ng savings, but at the bottom of the succeeding GAA, ay wala na yung provision na yun, Mr. Chair. So my question related to that, are these provisions still operative? the provision that I just read a while ago, that savings may likewise refer to available balances of appropriations arising from unused compensation and related costs pertaining to unfilled, vacant, or abolished position, etc., etc.
2017 ba yan?
2017, 2016, 2017, nandyan yung provision na yan.
Nasa NEP? Ay, nasa GA?
Nasa GA.
Antay na yun. Sakit na ng likod ko. Oy, Secretary.
Tinanggal yung yung sa PS na list of PS savings kasi mayroong particular section na ngayon na pag mayroon kang savings sa PS, you can already use for other PS requirements. So, hindi na kaya tinanggal na namin doon sa original sa version ng 2016-17. Because after the report, basta may unfilled positions na may savings na, pwede mo na siyang gawin. So ngayon, sir, saan ang section na yan?
Special Volume 1B, page 806.
Na-open natin pag may natira na pwede mo for other fees.
Yun ba nawala? Pa, pwede naman tingin ko wala man problema kung i-retain natin yan eh. Basta yung sinabi ng Supreme Court na pag PS, pwedeng gamitin sa PS lang.
Yes.
So, ewan ko kung ano pinagdidebatehan nyo ng mga to eh. Makukulit lang itong mga to eh. Gusto nila sila masunod. Pero ang sinasabi ko naman, kung wala naman talagang pinag-aawayan, bakit ba tayo nagpapakatagal dito?
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker. I asked that because if it's not already existing, I wonder because there are now 150,000 unfilled positions in the government. And if it were so, every year, savings po ito. No? Dahil every year, pinupunduhan naman natin ito. No? So, pero tinanggal yung provided na yan doon sa succeeding GAAS. So, that's my point, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker. Kaya dinidikdik ko yung savings. No? Dahil dito pa lamang, savings uli yan. No? At ang usapin ng savings ay talagang mahalaga, no? Dahil hindi lang dahil ilang beses na nagkaroon ng kaso sa usapin na ito, lalong-lalo na yung leading case, no, ng Araulio versus Aquino doon sa DAP case, no? Mahalaga po na malaman ng mamamayan kung paano ba ginugugol ng pamahalaan ang ating napakalimitadong resources, lalo na ngayon na lumulobo rin ang ating utang. At meron naman kahit na lumalaki ang ating budget, lumulubo ang ating utang, eh ngayon nalaman natin na meron palang savings, no? At ang savings na ito ay dapat inuulat ng ehekutibo sa kapulungang ito at sa mamamayan. At bilang panghuli, wag ho nating hayaan, no, na ang ating kapangyarihan, itong tinatawag sa konstitusyon na power of the purse, ay makastraight, no? Mawala. No, dahil sa isang probisyon na parang napaka-inosente, pero ang ibig pong sabihin nito ay tinatanggalan ng kapangyarihan ang Kongreso na pagdebatihan kung paano ba gugugulin ang ating napakalimitadong pondo, no? Dahil if this provision allowing the President to realign the entire budget, no, by this inserting this provision taken from the Bayanihan Act, next year, the entire 4.5 trillion theoretically can become savings. And because it is savings, it can be used by the executive to augment. It's a big pork barrel actually mangyayari doon. No? It's a presidential pork barrel dahil pwede na niyang dalhin kung saan niya gustong dalhin theoretically yung entire 4.5 trillion.
Yeah. Pero nakita naman natin, yung mismong pinakita mo kanina 3 billion, 6 billion, na halos since 2016, hindi naman talaga siya ginagamit, dineclare as savings at ginamit pang augment. So, iniingatan din talaga yung DAP decision. Kaya ang sinasabi ko, kung may malaki ang gamit nito, yung paggamit po sa Bayanihan 1. Kasi nga, tayo na mismo nagsabi, wala tayo masyadong pera, kaysa dumaan tayo sa karayom, o yung buong budget, gamitin mo kung alin dyan kung ang sa tingin mo dapat i-discontinue, yung dapat na gamitin muna natin panlaban sa pandemya.
For as long as pinagdebatihan ng Kongreso yan next year, Mr. Chair, I don't think, Mr. Sponsor, I don't think may problema doon. No? But in this manner, talagang blank check lang yan. Bahala ka na, executive, next year. No? So, I'm glad na the good sponsor earlier said no, that this has to be truly re-examined, this provision. No?
No, we'll take it out.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sponsor.
Unless there are parameters, it should be taken out.
Thank you. So I will end now my interpellation to the good sponsor. Thank you for graciously answering our questions to clarify some points, no? Especially in this issue of savings.
Thank you for
Maraming salamat po. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Sponsor.
Thank you for sympathizing with my inability to sit down. Thank you very much.
Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move that we suspend interpellations on the general principles and provisions of the proposed 2021 national budget.
Is there any objection? Hearing none, motion is approved. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, before we proceed, we'd like to remind all of our colleagues about Section 94 of Rule 13 of our rules.